Let's go back to this BBC story. This is absolutely fascinating. BBC facing pressure to reveal if taxpayers' money funded a controversial Gaza film. Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch has now spoken about this. She's called for an inquiry into potential collusion after the documentary featured Hamas minister's son. It's not just that, by the way. There's much more to it, as we'll find out in a moment. She also threatened to withdraw Tory support for the licence fee unless the BBC proved its true impartiality. Let's speak to David Collier, the investigative journalist who uncovered the hidden links between the documentary and Hamas. David, good afternoon to you. I mean, can I just say firstly, I mean, great bit of journalism on your part, and like all journalists and investigative journalists in particular, you must at some point have thought, hang on, why didn't anybody else find out about this? That must have been a point when you thought, and the BBC, who commissioned the darn thing, in particular.
Yeah, I mean, it was, the show went out at 9 o'clock on the Monday evening, so I spent the first 3 or 4 hours kind of scraping away at it between 1 and 3 a.m. because it just kept me up, because the adrenaline started running as I started to began to realise what I was actually finding.
Yeah.
And between 3 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the morning, I was just double. I just could not believe that it actually made this mistake. It was just so catastrophic. So it was just going back over. I said, where have I made the mistake? What have I done wrong?
Yeah.
But in the end, that's not the way it turned out.
And of course, the big headline is that the young boy fronting this documentary, Abdullah, is that, I mean, people will politely say he's the son of a government minister. Others would say, well, he's the son of a terrorist. I mean, you could look at it that way, not unreasonably. But that's just where the story starts. I mean, there's much more to this.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the issue with the funding and the money. I mean, the BBC say that they worked with this child, you know, the son of a Hamas minister, for weeks. And like it or not, however you want to describe him, his father belongs to a prescribed terrorist group. And the question is, well, did money change hands? I mean, they must have. It's a child. You don't just put a child in front of a camera. You write the contract. You speak to the parents. You know, there's safeguarding issues. And I'm sure the BBC aren't going to, you know, admit that they completely, you know, forewent all of the safeguarding here. So did money change hands? And has the state broadcaster, our license fee money, moved to a member of a prescribed terrorist organisation? And as you say, that's just a start.
Yeah.
Because the other members in the, you know, I mean, the 2 girls in the documentary, their father worked for the Hamas police, the Gaza police, with the Hamas enforcers. Another child was seen holding a gun, standing next to Hamas terrorists. Basically, everywhere we turn, there's a Hamas link.
Yeah, including, as I understand, one of the crew even posting post-October 7th their jubilation at what had happened.
Yeah, firstly, there was that. There's one of the cameramen on October the 7th posted it, but one of the girls as well, the elder sister, she's shown on camera. And on her Facebook profile, on the 27th of January 2023, there was a terrorist attack in Jerusalem where 7 Jews were murdered outside a synagogue. And she was busy praising that. And the BBC portray her as some kind of innocent person we're meant to feel sympathy for.
I mean, at all levels, this is... I mean, it's beyond, journalistically, it is beyond belief that this has happened. And I know, you know, I'm looking at all sorts of voices on social media, and I guess largely it depends on where somebody sits politically as to what view they form. But the one thing everybody should agree on is that even if the documentary went ahead, it should still, by any journalistic measure, have identified the fact that the person fronting it was related to a member of the government. Let's put it politely.
I mean, firstly, you can't really use anything from Gaza without putting on a caveat.
Of course.
Because Hamas have editorial control. So I'm actually against the idea that our media generally, not just the BBC, have been running reports from Gaza. It's effectively just propaganda from Hamas that they've been fed. So there's that side of it. But yeah, it's look, I am one person with a keyboard and I don't speak Arabic. And I found this in hours. So how is it possible that the BBC, the entire organisation, failed to do the due diligence necessary? It's basically they just did not want to know.
Well, you'd have to have... I mean, anybody that would have first seen the rushes of that documentary, as they call them, would have gone, right, where'd you get that kid from? I mean, that's, you know, he's clearly he's very fluent. He's clearly a bright kid. Nobody's, you know, he's quite a good presenter. Nobody's disputing any of that. However, where'd you get him from? And what's the, you know, what did you have to do to get him? You know, you're making a documentary on a very sensitive issue, as you rightly say, David. Whether it should have been made in the first place is another debate. But once it had been commissioned and they began to see the footage of what it looked like, somebody would have said, oh, we need to find out a little bit more, particularly when you're using underage characters, and in this case there's a young teenage boy. So that would have, the BBC would have needed, in terms of if for no other reason, I mean, put the journalistic side part to the side for 1 second, in terms of due diligence and care, they would needed to have known about the backstory of that child.
If they had just done the basic search, right, not even a deep search, a basic search, they would have quickly seen that he was used by Channel 4 several times, late 2023 and early 2024, and they would have seen that he was given a different name with a different father. So at the very least, you start saying, well, hang on a minute, what's going on here? You know, the questions that should have been asked from the very beginning, they didn't do this work at all, and we need to hold them account. And basically, our money, our funding, our license fee has been used to spread Hamas propaganda. We have hundreds of thousands of people every 2 weeks walking through London with the Palestinian flag, and that's no surprise if our state broadcaster is a Hamas mouthpiece.
Yeah, spot on. Was this an independent production, David?
I believe so. I think there is a middleman here. I think there's an independent company that was used, and I think one of the two co-producers is a Palestinian activist who was in Gaza 8 or 9 months ago.
And the reason I ask that is because it doesn't in any way let the BBC off the hook. In fact, in many respects, it makes it so much worse, because, you know, if ever there was a time when you might want to check and double check and triple check, you know what it's like as a journalist. You have to check sources. Anyone can write some old guff on social media, but if you want to be taken seriously, you've got to check sources, you've got to check context, you've got to know what you're doing. And anything, and it's not as if the BBC haven't previously been under the spotlight for, you know, for inaccuracies around this very story. So almost the chairman or whoever, well, I know the chairman is not editorially involved, but you take the point. The highest voice, the Director General, should have been at the meeting that looked at this film and said, right, we want the answer to that, that and that. And as you say, just a cursory bit of, you know, keyboard work would have thrown up at least some initial questions.
Absolutely. I mean, look, as I said, the assistant producer here, I mean, he's basically the main man, because the other assistant producer doesn't speak Arabic, which means that he's almost dependent on the Palestinian activist here to translate everything that's coming through. And you look at his timeline, and it's just, you are looking at an activist timeline just full of extremist comments. And he's the person that the BBC felt was responsible enough to basically manage this documentary. The more I looked into it, the more I know about it, the angrier I become.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, the BBC should be trying to employ you, David, you know, I don't know, to be exec-produced Panorama or something, just based on the work you put into this. Did you get any response personally from the BBC?
Yeah, you're joking, aren't you? I mean, seriously.
Kind of.
I mean, well, there you go. There's your answer.
Yeah.
But look, actually, there is a point in what you're saying. Because for the last, 17 months, myself and others have been finding consistent mistakes in this BBC material. Now, if I was the boss of the BBC and I had someone out there who was consistently finding errors in my reporting and I wanted accuracy, the first thing I would do is I would pick up the phone and talk to them. And I'd say, come, we need you. So I'm not chest beating here. It's just a basic, obvious thing for them to have done, was to reach out to the people who were finding the errors and ask them to come and help.
Yeah. Some of the head honchos over there at BBC Towers are going to be facing MPs this week for a bit of a grilling. I mean, I would imagine those MPs, certainly some of them, will be pretty diligent on this. I mean, this could, I mean, as if they shouldn't be embarrassed enough already. I mean, this could really spotlight and highlight some real shortcomings here.
I mean, this is an argument that's been going on for decades now with BBC bias, and it's gradually I mean, it's worsening situation every time, every year. It seems to have got worse and worse.
Yeah.
And they always come up with their excuses, or they just put down the shutters and they hide and double down on their errors. This time, I think it's too big. It's too obvious, it's too bad, and
Yeah.
there are no excuses out there. So I think that if there was ever an opportunity for us to finally get the BBC to answer the questions that really need to be asked about the inherent bias, and it's not just the Israel situation, there are other issues going on at the BBC as well, to finally bring them to account.
Yeah, spot on. David, let's speak again. It's been really interesting. Thank you. David Collier, an investigative journalist. He was the person that first uncovered that story of bias on the BBC and asked himself a very simple question. I hadn't seen this documentary, by the way, and I won't be able to now anyway. I wasn't that bothered, but I wouldn't be able to because it's been taken down. It's not even on iPlayer. But I think the first thing that you would ask, and you wouldn't have to be a journalist to ask this question, is about access. How do you get access to something? So when you've seen undercover reporting in all sorts of kind of areas, football hooliganism was, who was the fella that got himself the Chelsea, what was his name? Donald McIntyre, wasn't it? McIntyre got himself a tattoo of a football club. I won't say which one, but the best. And he was, kind of undercover as a like a football, quote, hooligan. And he was trying to establish that, a lot of bad stuff is still going on. The 1970s aren't behind us. Regardless of what the theme is, whether it's that or somebody infiltrating the goings-on in, I remember a panorama from years ago, some really disturbing stuff about what was happening in an old people's home, abuse of patients. You look at, you wonder who the source is or how they did this, and you usually marvel at it. You go, this is brilliant work. So that's sort of an undercover example. If it's an example where you've just got people talking, certainly I, doing this for a living, look at it and go, wow, that's brilliant. How did you get that person? What made you think of that person being the right character to interview on this story? So had I seen it, my first question would have been, wow, this kid's good. This kid that's presenting this, he's very fluent. He's very comfortable in front of the camera. Who is he? What's his backstory? How could that not have been asked at the BBC? It's impossible that the BBC wouldn't have gone, who is this kid? Because we need to know for a couple of reasons. One, editorially, I think we need to know a full amount of his background. But from the BBC, the broadcaster's perspective, we're putting a child on screen. We need to know a little bit about that. Was that child exploited to get this footage? We need to know. And if they'd have found out, they'd have gone, oh yeah, his dad is a terrorist. Or, sorry, what? Well, he's one of the senior members of Hamas. Yeah, that's like the same thing, right? Nobody asked that. And then you get into all the other characters that David quite rightly pointed out. It wasn't just the one kid. There were others and crew members and goodness knows who else. It's an absolute flipping mess. How this ever got commissioned. But I can only imagine the folk at Beeb HQ preening their whiskers going, oh, my God, we've got an amazing documentary.